ICFRC hosts community programs to address topics of international interest. We thank our members, volunteers, and sponsors and interns for making these forums possible since 1983. That was the year that Every Breath You Take by The Police was the #1 pop song. Okay, I gotta stop there. Anybody else like me? And that could be either a beautiful love song or the Stalker's anthem. Every breath you take, I'll be watching you. You decide. I do love that song, actually. I want to acknowledge our university and community supporters, the University of Iowa's international programs, the University of Iowa's honors program, the University of Iowa Center for Public Policy, and the Stanley UI Foundation Support Organization for their financial support. And I also want to thank today's special sponsors, Neil Zhang, USB Matching Gifts, Alan Swanson, and Blank & McCune Realtors. I also thank City Channel 4 for professionally recording our programs for cablecast on City Channel 4 or 118-2 and UI Library's digital archives. Now, it is my absolute pleasure to introduce Chad Hart today. Chad is an extension economist and associate professor of economics at Iowa State University. Chad is a native of Southwest Missouri, growing up in a rural homestead near Stark City, Missouri. He received his Ph.D. in economics and statistics in 1999 from Iowa State University, and his work has concentrated on crop marketing, crop insurance, international trade agreements, and bioenergy policy. Chad is also a partner in FarmRisk, an Iowa firm that develops revenue insurance products for agriculture. Over the course of the past couple of years, there has been a lot of conversation about international trade and the benefits and costs from it. From the renegotiations of the North America Free Trade Agreement to the volley of tariff announcements between the U.S. and China, international trade policy is in a state of flux. That uncertainty has direct and indirect impacts for the Iowa economy as Iowa's and the U.S. agriculture sector has developed to meet international needs. Chad will explore the current set of trade agreements, disputes, and organizations, examine how Iowa agriculture fits in the global economic system, and outline the benefits and costs from international trade. Please join me in welcoming Chad Hart.
Well, my name is Chad Hart. I am from Ames. I'm glad to be over here now as opposed to 2 weeks from now. I have done a presentation here in Iowa City during game week. Needless to say, I do not wear red when I come over here during that time. But yeah, we're here to talk about international trade agreements and agriculture. And actually, I'm going to have you focus in on the map behind my title here today. Because when you're looking at agriculture, especially globally here, what this map represents, anywhere where you see color on this map, you're looking at soils where you can have agriculture. The idea is the colors indicate the quality of the soil and therefore tell you something about the agricultural productivity that you could see there. As you're moving from the reds to the yellows to the greens, what you're seeing are soils that are, if you will, more performing. You have higher yields. As you look another direction, as you're looking from, say, the blues to the purples to the greens, you're looking at soils that are more resilient, soils that can be farmed over and over again. What most countries would like to see is a lot of green. The green is a highly productive, highly resilient soil. And arguably, when you're looking at global agriculture, the idea is, if you will, the soil drives which countries tend to dominate the agricultural economy worldwide. How many spots of green do you see up on this map? Lots? I'll give you 3 big ones. That's it. The idea is, as you look down in South America, there's a little green down there. That's why we always talk about Brazil and Argentina as being an agricultural powerhouse. When you look in the Black Sea region, they're right underneath my agreements there. We talk about the Ukraine and Crimea area because that used to be the breadbasket of the former Soviet Union. But the largest green splotch on this map, we just happen to live right in the middle of. And so when you think about global agriculture, think back to this map a lot, because it's what's going to drive a lot of what we see when we talk about agricultural trade. It tends to flow from those green areas to the rest of the world. And as you look at, why Iowa plays in such an important mix here, again, it goes back to those green spots. Now, for me, being an extension economist here in the state of Iowa, I spend a lot of time talking about two crops: corn, soybeans. Why? Because it dominates the landscape here. And as you can see, worldwide, the U.S. tends to dominate the landscape in the production of those commodities. This is the most recent update we have on corn production worldwide. As you look at the world, especially as we look at the 2018 numbers here, you are looking at the world's largest corn crop we've ever produced. The U.S. tends to produce about a third of the world's corn, and Iowa, being the corn producing state that is, we're the number one producing state as we look across the nation. And so as you look here, what you're seeing is actually, over the past 5 years, actually the world has seen the 5 best crops it has ever seen. We've seen incredible productivity in global agriculture, not just U.S. agriculture, over the last 5 years. But as you look down the line here, you'll notice that the U.S. tends to be a dominant producer when it comes to corn. Second largest producer in the world is China. And in this case, I'm going to argue what you're seeing in China, and I'll apologize to those of you in back, they're the next to last line on this table, is when you look at China, they just produce enough to meet their own needs. Whereas here in the U.S., we're producing more than enough to meet only our own needs, but help cover for the rest of the world. And as you go down the line here, what you'll see is that we do have corn production throughout the rest of the world. But the idea is, again, it tends to go back to where are those green spots on that map. That's where you're going to see the bulk of the production. And a crop that really has gotten highlighted over the past year and a half has been soybeans, due to the disputes that we're having, especially with China. The idea is, as you look at the global soybean picture, it's basically the same as corn. And that over the last 5 years, those have been the 5 biggest soybean crops the world has ever seen. The U.S. produces roughly a third of all the production worldwide. What is different about soybeans, though, is I want you to look just a couple of lines down from the U.S. and look at Brazil. And what we are starting to see is, if you will, that South American production, that green spot down there, really coming to its fore. And it's growing in production. And arguably, by the end of next year, Brazil will be the largest producer of soybeans in the world. And so as you're looking here, what you're going to see is there are a few key countries that are going to drive production. Those are the same countries that will likely drive trade as we look at the agricultural perspective. Now, when you look here at Iowa, the idea is we're not just corn and soybeans. If anything, when you look here in Iowa, what you tend to see is a better balance, mix when we look at across our agricultural spectrum. This is just showing you, as of the most recent year where we have full data, 2016, what we export in terms of value basis here from the state of Iowa. And these numbers over here with the rankings, that shows you relative to other states here within the U.S. And so, for example, soybeans. We tend to be the number 2 export state. We tend to be in a, if you will, a foot race with Illinois in terms of the production side. What is a little different here is that we tend to actually use a few more of our soybeans than Illinois does. So they tend to export more. We tend to conserve more within the state. But you're still talking about $3 billion worth of exports to the Iowa economy coming from just soybeans alone. And as you go down the line here, you notice number 1 in pork, number 1 in corn, number 1 in feeds. Yep. These are things that I think people are traditionally used to thinking about when they think about the Iowa agricultural economy. Where it tends to go a little bit different is as you go down the line. We are still number 4 on the beef side. We're number 12 in dairy. We are the nation's largest producer of eggs, as you think about it. And so when you're looking at Iowa, it's on the agricultural side, we have this broad mix between our crops and our livestock. But in almost every case, if you will, we produce more than what this state needs. And so we do look outside of our borders for customers, whether it's here in the U.S. or outside of the U.S. And it tends to be a big driving factor because I want you to compare these agricultural values to just looking at, for example, our manufacturing sector. And do you notice a slight difference in the amounts being put up here? For the most part, Iowa is still an agriculturally driven state. We do have a strong mix of manufacturing here, of industry in, for example, finance. But the idea is almost all of that ties back into agriculture. You know, even as I look here at the, top manufacturing exports, what is number one? John Deere tractors. I wonder what they do. And so, when you're thinking here, the idea is that even as we look at our, in this case, our manufacturing sector, that is still a large export focus as you look at the state of Iowa. In fact, if you were to sort of tear apart the Iowa economy, what you'd find is that if we measure, and this is the way, if you will, economists at the state level look at the Iowa economy, agriculture is not actually the largest slice. So if you look, we're dominated by manufacturing at nearly 20% of our economy here. You've got government actually at 11%, real estate another 11%, insurance and finance at 10%, and then finally agriculture comes in. But the idea is that's just measuring, if you will, direct production agriculture, creating the corn, the soybeans, the cattle, the hogs, the eggs. But I want you to think about the connectedness within our economy. For example, you look at that manufacturing sector, and again, what was the biggest slice when we looked at manufacturing exports? Tractors, farm machinery. So a lot of our manufacturing base, if you will, is connected back to our agricultural base. It's driven by that. When we look at the government, the largest department we have in the state is the Department of Agriculture. When you think about real estate, the biggest thing there is I want you to think about how our land is owned in the state and how it is utilized. Farm Bureau? No. But I am going to point to a lot of folks in this room. When you think about our lands here in the state of Iowa, we've got 36 million acres in this state. Roughly 24 million of it is used in row crop production, so basically corn and soybeans. Who owns the vast majority of that land? I'm going to say more seasoned people as opposed to all. But when you look here, what we found is that we do a study every 5 years looking at not just ag land values, but total land, if you will, ownership here in the state of Iowa. And roughly 37% of all the land in this state is owned by a widow who is 75 and older. When you look at all the land across the state of Iowa,
You said how many percent?
37.
You said how many percent?
37.
One more time?
37.
All right.
Now, did you get it this time? Just in case, it's 37%. Now, and when you're looking at that land, out of all the land across this state, 80% of it is owned outright. There's no mortgage on it. Only 20% of the land has mortgage on it. But when you think about our ag lands, farmers only own roughly 50% of what they farm. The other half, they rent that land. And in fact, as you move, especially north to north central Iowa, that percentage goes more to 70 to 80% of the land that we farm is rented. And so when you think about the values in real estate, a lot of that is, again, driven by agriculture. Keep on going down the line here. When you're looking at finance and insurance, one of the biggest sectors is crop insurance. So again, as we look at the major sectors, the major slices of the pie within the Iowa economy, almost all of them come back and have an agricultural root to them. If you will, ag just hits everywhere when you look at our economy. And so when we think about the jobs that we have within the state, we can argue that roughly 25% of all the jobs in the state have some connection back to agriculture. That it is the base with which our state moves forward. And since we produce more than we need, that's where agricultural trade plays such a large part of what we look at when we're looking at the Iowa ag economy. Now, this is some data that USDA put together over the past year looking at the value of agricultural trade. And what has been happening to agriculture, especially over the last 40 years, is we have seen, if you will, the world global economy change dramatically. Back when I was a young kid in the 60s and 70s, the idea was that in most countries, no, they depended upon producing all of their agricultural needs internally. That is now no longer the case. Trade now dominates the sphere when we look at agriculture. And in fact, when you look at the U.S., we're talking about exporting $135 billion worth of product within a year. Back 40 years ago, that would have been more like $13 billion. We've seen dramatic increases in trade flows across agriculture. And when you look at agriculture, what they figure is for every dollar exported, we're looking at $1.27 in terms of economic activity in the state that generates that. And so you're looking at something that definitely adds value to the economy by having that trade. And in fact, they estimated, this is USDA's estimates here, that as we look across the entire nation, my apologies, you're talking about over 1 million of our jobs here in the state are definitely just related to agricultural exports, not looking at the breadth of all the exports that we see coming out of the U.S. And it's a number that continues to build and grow. These were the numbers for 2016. USDA updated them for 2017, and what we found was ag exports have continued to grow. Now $140 billion a year. And in fact, when we look at agricultural trade here for the U.S., it is one of the few sectors in the economy where we actually have a trade surplus. We export more than we import. And to me, again, it goes back to that first map I showed you in those green dots. That is, when you think about producing food and feed products for the world, it has to come from those green dots. And so when we look at who we trade with, who are our partners, and this is where the trade disputes loom large, this is just a map showing you sort of where do our products go. So number one, China. They represent a massive market for us. Roughly $20 to $25 billion worth of agricultural products leaves the U.S. and goes to China. They became our number one trade partner on the ag side about 3 years ago. And that's a market that has grown tremendously for us, especially over the last 20 years. And again, if you think back to my map, one of the few places that didn't have a green spot was China. When you think about our soybean market, they are our number one purchaser. In fact, basically, before the trade dispute, what you could say is this, is that you could walk out into a soybean field, pick 3 pods off. One of those 3 pods is going to China. Fully 1/3 of our soybean crop was destined not only for exports, but exports specifically to China. It's a massive market for us. In terms of overall trade with the U.S., we're talking about anywhere from $10 to $14 billion, depending on what was happening there. So the vast bulk of the trade with China all comes down to soybeans. And that's why this trade dispute with China has gotten a lot of, if you will, attention from the Iowa media. Because, you know, if you think back again, what is our biggest export when we look at the state of Iowa? What are we putting out there for the rest of the world? Soybeans is that number one commodity, and China is that number one market. Now, looking beyond them, though, I'm going to tell you they're not the only trade partner we have in town. Number 2 here, Canada. And Canada for us is actually roughly the same size as China, $20 to $25 billion worth a year. NAFTA looms large there, especially when you combine them with who's number 3 here, Mexico, worth about $17 to $18 billion as we look down the line. A decade ago, number 4 was number 1. I'm talking about Japan there. Traditionally, and especially basically since World War II up until about 1995, they were our biggest trade partner on the agricultural side. And then as you go further down the line, the European Union at 5, and then South Korea at 6. What I often point out to folks is when you think about this slide, I want you to think about, okay, is it necessarily dominated by where most people live? Not really. What's the dominant features that sort of determine our agricultural trade patterns? Wealth is a big one. And I'm not going to say diplomacy. I'm going to argue just geographic proximity. If you think about ag trade, it is still sort of localized. How far can you go with a box of fresh fruit? How far can you move a gallon of milk? Proximity still matters here. And that's why, especially as you look at the importance to agriculture, arguably, while China is such a large market, it's the NAFTA agreement that is receiving more press within agriculture, because that's picking on roughly $40 billion worth of exports as opposed to just 20. And again, when you look at our sales, soybeans dominate. In fact, that's one of the more interesting things over the past decade especially. Soybeans started out as a relatively small crop. Actually, if you go back to World War II even, we were planting less than 1 million acres to soybeans at that time. Now we plant nearly 90 million acres across the country. It has sort of, if you will, exploded on the scene in agriculture. And the reason it did is because it found such a large international following, if you will. That is a crop that is easy to move around, has a variety of uses. It can fit on your plate. It can be fed to animals. It can be used in industrial processes. And so it's a highly flexible crop. And so it's, if you will, perfectly designed for trade. And we've definitely developed that market for that. And as you go down the line here, corn next, then notice my favorite one at number 3, tree nuts. Almonds, pistachios. You don't have to grow many because they're worth an awful lot. And yes, when you're looking at your pistachios, your almonds, roughly 80 to 90% of all world production comes from the U.S. In fact, in the case of almonds, 80% of all world production comes from 3 counties in California. But do those 3 counties in California depend upon trading it with the rest of the world? Yes, they do. And so as you go down the line here, beef, pork, some of your more traditional crops. But the idea is when you think about agricultural trade, the idea is we're trading everything right now. It's not just limited to a couple of crops. It is spread throughout all of agriculture. Now, like I say, the value of agricultural trade has changed dramatically over the last 40 years. This just gives you a slight feel for, if you will, how exports have moved versus imports. Why the U.S. is a dominant agriculture player, that doesn't mean we don't buy agricultural production from other areas. If you will, what trade does is it gets you to concentrate on what you do relatively better than somebody else. So in our case, what do we do well? Yep, corn, soy, tree nuts, a little beef, a little pork. What do we buy from others?
Seafood.
Seafood's a big one. Wheat is actually one where we'll pull in a fair amount. Rice is another one where we tend to bring stuff in. Fruit and veggies are a big one. Biggest thing I want you to think about is, getting ready, and since we're getting ready for football season, I want you to think back to the last couple of Super Bowls. And if you've watched the commercials for that, there's always been a commercial for avocados from Mexico. How big a market is that? Yeah, it's gigantic. It's big enough that they could afford that Super Bowl commercial. That tells you an awful lot, actually, that they could advertise that there. But when you look at the value of trade, in this case, the top line there is basically our exports. The bottom line there are our imports. What you see is growth in both. And this goes back to a lot of what drives trade is, again, not population, but wealth. As our wealth is increased, as wealth is increased worldwide, we see more trade occurring here. Now, you'll see I've got arrows and countries pointed in there. Those are the free trade agreements that the U.S. has and when they were implemented. We sort of started down the line of agricultural free trade way back in the 1980s. In fact, our first test case, if you will, was Israel. Very small market, but it sort of worked out the bugs for our next one that was the biggest one, arguably, for agriculture, NAFTA. And the one that's being negotiated or renegotiated here today. When you look at NAFTA, I'm going to argue NAFTA helps explain a lot of the growth behind it. The thing that you need to know about trade agreements, especially agricultural ones, is they don't take weeks or months to develop. They literally take years. Does anybody actually know, okay, in this case, NAFTA was signed into agreement in 1994. When did we start negotiating to set up that agreement? Anybody know? 1979. The negotiations started under Carter, continued under Reagan, went to Bush Sr., continued on through Clinton. It takes a great deal of time to negotiate these agreements, because when it comes back to it again, a lot of countries still fall back on, we need to produce everything we can internally to protect ourselves. At the same time too, though, in order to grow an economy and to grow it well, you're better off allowing some specialization to occur. And especially through NAFTA, that's what we found. When you look at the economies of the US, of Canada, of Mexico, after the signing of NAFTA, you've seen basically the greatest growth run for all three of those countries after the agreement was signed. In fact, as I stand before you today, we're in the longest bull run of an economy we've ever had. We've never had a recovery last this long, uninterrupted by a recession. And a lot of that, I'm going to argue, was driven by trade. And we've continued to search for partners on free trade agreements. Notice our last one was there in 2012, 2013. Colombia, Peru, and that country that was number 6 on my list in terms of agricultural trade. In fact, as you look at this list, what you find is that once we sign a trade agreement, what we tend to see are those countries are the ones that are our strongest partners, that we're doing the most trade with, because we've lowered those barriers. And it not only means that we're buying more from them, but we're also selling more to them as well. In fact, when you break down our exports and look at the patterns we see there, what we've basically seen is as we trade with the rest of the world, we have seen some growth. But where we've seen the biggest piece of that growth is with our free trade partners. The lower we make those trade barriers, the more we see trade increase on both sides, with one exception. And I wanted to bring that exception out because that's that red line down at the bottom. China is a trade partner that, if you will, I'm going to argue on the agricultural side, it is a combination of we and they are too big to fail. We are the world's largest agricultural producer. They are the world's largest agricultural user. And so in a certain sense, we have to trade with each other. In fact, that's what's been interesting about this dispute. For example, I know as soon as the tariff started, I was getting calls from farmers. Does this mean China is going to stop buying our soybeans? And the answer is no. They can't. But at the same time, too, we can't find a market to replace them either. We can't afford not to sell to them. Even though tariffs go in place, doesn't necessarily mean trade shuts down. It slows down. Doesn't have to shut down. And in the case of U.S. and China, that's what you have seen happen. Trade has slowed. The rest of the world is adjusting to figure out what these two behemoths are going to do. And in the meanwhile, this was mentioned in the introduction, if you will, ag trade remains in flux, waiting to see what's going to happen. The reason U.S. farmers have been, if you will, sort of vocal about, in this case, one of the things that was most interesting to me is when President Trump announced there was going to be an aid package to farmers. Almost across the board, when you listen to the commodity groups, the farm bureaus, the National Corn Growers Association, 3 words came out. Trade, not aid. Because they recognize that their market growth, especially over the past decade, was driven by trade. And to me, it comes back to these points right here. And in fact, this is something I do with my class every semester I get a hold of. And we talk about how trade influences agriculture. And when it comes back down to it, I point out the ideas that I'm reminded of something that when I was growing up, my parents ran a little locker plant in southwest Missouri. And yes, you can pronounce it Missouri. It's the only state that's legal that has two pronunciations because we can't agree. But the idea is my parents ran that locker plant there, and my dad, he would turn me loose. I would run the plant, basically, if you will, babysit it on Saturdays. And he told me, Chad, you got two rules that you have to live by here while you're looking at the plant. Number one, remember, the customer is always right. I was like, okay, well, what's number two? He goes, never forget rule number one. And if you will, ag is driven that way as well. Where are our customers? When you think about this great big globe, there's 7 billion of us on this planet. How many of them live here in the U.S.? 4%. That means 96% of our potential customers live somewhere else. So population does matter, but also economic growth, incomes matter. And arguably, that's been the biggest thing that has been changing agricultural trade over the past decade. It's not the population growth, it's where we're seeing the income growth. And that's where China stands out. When you look at China's economy over the past decade, it has been growing at 6 to 8% per year, generating a lot of income for the folks there. And what we find is that as people get more income, what they demand is more and better quality food. And that tends to lead towards more agricultural trade. But as you go down the line here, the other thing is from the U.S. side, we produce surpluses in almost everything we do. And so we're built for the export markets. We tend to export a lot of stuff that we don't like to eat, but that other people do. And so that plays well for us. And it definitely adds to our farm income, which again, contributes a lot to the state economy. I've already hit this point a little bit, but just to reinforce it, when you look at where we stand in terms of world population, the U.S. is actually a very small slice of the pie. We tend to have an overinflated sense of ourselves because we don't tend to think outside of our borders. But I'm going to argue if you're in agriculture, you have to, because that's where your customers are. And when we look at that customer base, it is shifting as we look worldwide. In fact, as you look at population growth, one of the things I like to tell people is we're always looking for who is the next China? Who is that next market that can grow? Nigeria is not a bad thought. I'm going to say India will be our next one. Probably 10 to 15 years from now. We'll talk about India like we talk about China today. And then about 30 years from now, I'm looking at Nigeria. I'm looking at basically all of sub-Saharan Africa. Because what you're seeing there is not only a population growth, especially as they basically get better medical technology in order to increase lifespan there, but you're seeing income growth. And as that income grows, and in this case, let's look at that economic growth rate there as well. Nigeria actually takes a little hit recently. Because Nigeria, what is their big thing that they can trade right now? Oil. And so right now, their, if you will, economic lives swing with the energy market. But what this brings into bear is that when you're looking at ag trade, what you want to look at is not just population, but more importantly, income. Like I say, this is the graph that really brought it home to me. This is in terms of millions of households. How many of those households have an income of $20,000 or more? Now, $20,000 doesn't sound like much to us here in the U.S., but when you think on a global picture, it's middle class. All right, stare at China and India there for a while. You're talking about they'll have more households than we have people. Middle class. That's what drives trade. That's what drives who our partners are. And when you look at our export markets, again, China number one, but notice Canada and Mexico number 2 and 3 there. By the time it's all said and done, we trade with about 140 countries across the world in a variety of products. When you look at our trade scale, in this case, we're not the top export state. California is. Again, it comes back to those nuts. My God, are they worth a lot. But the idea is when you come down the line, like I say, in U.S. agriculture, it really doesn't matter whether I'm looking at California or Georgia or Iowa. The idea is we create surpluses. Those surpluses go to the rest of the world. So I doubt you can see the colors here, but just concentrate on the percentages. The idea is you look at 79% of our walnuts are exported, 76% of our cotton, almonds, 2/3 in this year. The idea is soybeans here on the middle left, 50%. Doesn't matter where you look within agriculture, trade is a major piece of the marketplace. And that's why you saw those groups say they wanted trade and not aid. They recognize this is how they build that market. Because I'm going to argue in the end, when it comes down to it, this is the big thing that sort of drives that. You think about the Chinas, the Indias, tremendous population, but if you go back to that map I have, they actually have a relatively small portion of arable land. They'll never be able to produce as much as they need. Where are they going to find the food and feedstuffs that they need? It comes through trade. And in fact, if you take you back to that map again and you stare at it, the idea is, when you look here, it's actually amazing how much we produce, given that, roughly half the world, you can't farm on it. Greenland doesn't look so green on this map. What you see are the areas that don't have those green spots, trying to figure out how to get along with, or at least be in business with, the spots that do. For a country like China, what that means is you trade when you can, you buy what you can't. One of the things that's real interesting right now is when you look at what China is doing right now, they're trading here with us here in the U.S. They're investing down in South America. In fact, one of the biggest beneficiaries of if you will, bond service here is that China has been doing a lot for the Brazilian and Argentine infrastructure, helping them pay for port improvements, helping them pay for rail improvements. Why? Because they want that transportation system to improve so that product can move out of that green spot there and enter the marketplace. And even in a place like Nigeria, China's investing in land improvement there. So again, tap into the agricultural bounty that even Africa, you think about Africa being relatively poor, but that big red spot there, what that indicates is there's a lot of actually agriculturally productive land there. Africa produces roughly 90% of all it needs. They have to trade for the other 10. And so when you think about what's driving trade here, that's the biggest deal. That's why we're talking about these trade agreements so much. It relates back to what we just had, a good fine meal here. And it's crucial to our economy. All right, I have rattled and prattled on till 1 o'clock. I want to thank you for your time, and I look forward to the questions that we'll have here in just a minute or two.
Are American taxpayers having to pay $16.5 billion for Trump's tariffs?
Okay. When you're thinking about tariffs, the easiest way to describe this is who pays for the tariffs. It's a combination of basically two folks. You can think of when that tariff gets put in place here in the U.S., for example. Who ends up paying for that tariff is their producers and our consumers. And vice versa, when a tariff in another country comes on, who pays for it? That would be our producers and their consumers. And so yes, when you're looking at the balance on who pays for these tariffs, it is a mix between both the country that's getting the tariff placed upon it and the country that's placing the tariff, because it does impact consumer prices. And in fact, that's one of the biggest things that we're trying to figure out as we look at the variety of tariffs being thrown around here. As President Trump has announced these tariffs are coming at us so quickly, it's hard to decipher who all is paying for what here. Because you're talking about tariffs in a magnitude that we've never seen before. Typically, when we get in trade disputes like this, you're talking about, we're going to target maybe $1 billion worth of products for tariffs. This go round, we went from $3 billion to $50 billion to discussions about $200 billion. This is a trade war of size and scale we have never seen before. Now, that said, I'm going to tell you that our agricultural markets have actually fared fairly well despite all this rhetoric. In fact, when I look at trade flows right now, they're still relatively robust despite the tariffs. But I think a lot of that is due to the thought process that some of these tariffs will disappear fairly quickly. Case in point, one of the things I've been watching are the NAFTA renegotiations. If those have gotten to the point where we do have at least a preliminary agreement with Mexico, that knocks off some of the tariffs that we're facing right now. But yeah, it's true that consumers do bear a sizable portion of paying for those tariffs. All right, Sandra, you got another one for me?
Yeah, the thing is that there's quite a few questions on
Yep.
tariffs, so I'm trying to figure out, you've, I think, answered some of these
Excellent.
already. So I'll run through them very quickly because they're all related to tariffs. Figured that might be the easiest. What will happen about tariffs? Are there ways to improve tariffs and production? And how do you assess President Trump's tariffs on China and his approach to NAFTA?
Okay.
So it's kind of a
Yep.
big subject.
So when you're thinking about, in this case, especially, let's say I kind of need to separate China from the NAFTA discussion, because I'm going to argue President Trump has different objectives when he's looking at those two disputes. When we're looking at the dispute with China, it really comes down to a lot of it is intellectual property rights. How are we going to do business as we go forward? China internationally is notorious for being very, let's call it strict, in how outside companies can work within China. And oftentimes their agreements required that if a technology was developed and to be traded in China, that you had to partner with a Chinese company, and that Chinese company had to have access to all the technology. At which time, amazingly enough, that technology would be turned into a competing product, and then the original company would get squeezed out. So there are some very significant trade implications from that. This dispute about intellectual property rights existed long before President Trump took office. In fact, if you go back and think about how President Obama and President Bush before him and President Clinton before him talked about trade with China, intellectual property rights almost always came up as a source of contention. What has been different about how President Trump has approached it is he has been very, let's call it direct, in saying, okay, I'm going to fight, not necessarily fire with fire, but he's going to lob a lot of stones. So he's definitely taking on something there. That is different than what we're seeing with the NAFTA renegotiations. With NAFTA, it's not a question about intellectual property rights. It's that I believe, in this case, President Trump believes he can strike a better deal. And that's what we're waiting to see if he can or cannot. What I will describe it from an agricultural perspective is this: he probably can't. When I look at NAFTA from an Iowa perspective, it was about as good as it got. The goods and services that we traded back and forth between Iowa and Canada and Mexico, almost all of those had absolutely no tariffs on them. It was about as free and an open a trade as you can get. That's hard to improve upon. Now, there are other sectors of the economy and other sectors of the country where, yeah, you could see some improvement. And arguably, manufacturing, especially auto manufacturing, is a source of contention. That's one of the areas he was hoping to address. Now, I will say this, from a trade economist perspective, were we necessarily happy with President Trump's approach? I would say we'll describe it this way. We agree with some of the rationale. We disagree with the approach. We agree that there are problems with intellectual property rights. We agree that there are certain sectors of the economy that, if you will, have been damaged by allowing more open trade. What we disagree with is how you go about fixing those problems. In most cases, what you look to is how do you transition those sectors? Because in this case, trade is, there are winners and losers. The question is, how do you compensate the losers or find them, if you will, alternate ways to improve their way of life again? And that's something that every country wrestles with as they look at opening up their trading. All right, I'll stop for a sec, see if Sandra's got another one for me.
Actually got quite a few good, wonderful questions. So given China's antipathy towards any agents of disorder and their passion for long-range planning, won't they make new supply chains no matter what happens with Trump?
Okay. So the answer is yes, they will definitely make new supply chains. But at the same time, too, I'm going to say that when you look at China, what you are also seeing is an economy that is evolving where the government knows it will have less control. What you have seen them do over the past 20 years has, they've moved capitalist in some ways. They do allow markets to work. And especially when it comes to agriculture, they have found that they can't necessarily plan everything out. They recognize that they do have to reach out to other countries. They do have to partner and work with other countries. Because no matter how much they try to produce internally, they cannot meet their own needs. Roughly 25 years ago, China put out a very specific policy. It was basically known as they call it the four crops policy. They were going to be self-sufficient in corn, wheat, cotton, and rice. They tried for 20 years. They pulled it off for one. Not rice, not cotton, not corn. They could do it in wheat. What they have found and what you've seen them do is, again, they're evolving their approach. They are recognizing that they do need partners. They are developing, if you will, new supply chains. But that means working with a U.S., a Brazil, an Argentina, a South Korea, a Ukraine. Because when you've got 1.3 billion people, the bigger thing that they're worried about there is, if you will, maintaining civil society. And they recognize one of the biggest things that we've seen over the past decade is that if food becomes scarce or if food prices become very unstable, governments tend to become fairly unstable. And that is something that concerns the Chinese government greatly over there. And arguably, that's why as this trade dispute was developing with China, it took quite a while before soybeans was mentioned in it. Because that told you that China was trying to figure out to be able to do this in any way that didn't hit agriculture until it had to. If you will, until the trade dispute got large enough that they couldn't avoid bringing agriculture in. That's what the answer is again.
How sustainable is the current Iowa ag economy based on corn and soybeans, given the changing climate, loss of topsoil, water pollution, and growth of cities, among other challenges?
Okay. Well, I think when you're looking at the Iowa ag economy, it is something that arguably will continue to need to evolve and does. Take you back. Again, World War II. We had 24 million acres in production. Half of it went to corn. What was the other big crop back then? Oats. Today it's soybeans. What you tend to see is Iowa's ag economy moves to where it needs to go based upon, I would say, environmental and economic factors. As we're looking forward right now, for example, we're definitely worried about climate change impacting this map. Those soils aren't moving, but the weather conditions that support them do. One of the big things as I talk to my climatology friends is that they tell me as we look at Iowa, arguably, the first, well, I'll put it this way, the next 50 years look fairly good for Iowa agriculture in terms of we've got the soils and actually we're going to have more moisture to work with in order to grow the crops. The concern for Iowa comes in the 50 years after that. If you will, what we're watching right now is due to the changing climate, the Corn Belt is moving to the north and to the west. Right now, we're in the heart of it. 50 years from now, we'll be on the southern end of it. And 100 years from now, parts of Iowa may not be in the Corn Belt anymore. At the same time, too, does that impact, again, these soils don't move. So I think you're not only talking about Iowa agriculture having to evolve, but global agriculture has to evolve to the changing climate. And trying to figure out how do we maximize, if you will, our productivity while at the same time maintaining and hopefully, if you will, stabilizing the most precious commodity our agriculture has, Again, you don't grow a crop if you don't have a color on this map. We have to maintain the soil, especially if we're going to go from 7 billion people to 8 billion people to 9 billion people. And so, no, expect Iowa agriculture to continue to evolve. In fact, one of the biggest things that's not talked about when you look at agriculture is that agriculture has a lot of faults, but it also has been evolving to be more environmentally consistent. In fact, when you look at the use of the amount of nitrogen fertilizer here in the United States, it's roughly the same level now as it was in 1980. Yet we produce 4 times more food than we did back then. Is fertilization still a significant issue that we need to work through? Yes. But it's also a sign that the industry is trying to work through it, is trying to figure out how to be more efficient, is trying to figure out how to be more environmentally friendly as we look there. Yes, ma'am.
So how much of soybeans are used in ethanol?
Okay, quick answer on that. Soybeans, none. When you're thinking about it, it's corn. So when you're looking at corn, roughly 40% of our corn goes into ethanol. But I'm going to tell you that's not the end of the story. Because when you think about that bushel of corn going into ethanol, I want you to divide that bushel into thirds. About a third of that bushel actually gets converted into ethanol. About a third of that bushel is actually carbon dioxide. And actually, a lot of our ethanol plants capture that to utilize that in industrial processes. The third in the middle, livestock feed. Remember, when you're using this grain, and this is something I learned, I had a great uncle who, the best way I can describe him, he was a moonshiner. When he passed in 1989, we found he still had a still in the back barn. So the ethanol process is something, my family's known a little bit about. And the idea is you have what's called spent grains, what's left over once you do the fermentation process. It turns out that is a wonderful livestock feed. So if you will, just because that bushel of corn went to fuel for its first use, it wasn't its only use. Now, thinking about soybeans, though, I'll turn that back around. Is it used for biofuel? The answer is yes. Biodiesel. And I'm going to tell you roughly, 7 to 10% of our soybean crop does get utilized for biofuels. It's a relatively small part of the market, but the idea is it's there. As you look here in the state of Iowa, I believe, last time I looked, I think we've got 12 active biodiesel plants. Mainly making fuel, in this case, usually used in the summertime. Because with biodiesel, the issues they're working through there is diesel has a famous problem about gelling when it gets too cold. The biodiesel tends to do just the same as petroleum diesel. In fact, it's a little more sensitive. And so what you tend to see is a summertime market for that. But yeah, both of our crops are utilized for fuel. In fact, I'll take you back when we talked about World War II. Why were oats the number 2 crop here in the state of Iowa? Had a lot of horses. I'm going to argue, if you will, ag has always been in the energy industry. We were growing those crops to power our machinery at the time. It's just that our machinery, walked around on 4 legs then. Now we drive it around with a motor. But the idea is, if you will, ag has always been responsive to energy needs.
We are told China overbuilt its iron and steel industry and it dumps its surplus on the world market. We are not told the U.S. overbuilt its corn and soybean industry and it dumps its surplus on the world market. Where's the truth?
Okay. I'm not necessarily going to say we overbuilt. In fact, especially for the U.S. corn market, I'm not going to argue that we overbuilt on purpose. I'm going to point out that when you look and you think especially at the U.S. and our ag markets, we allow producers to choose what they produce. They're driven by wherever the market takes them. And in fact, when you look over the past several years, what the market has done here within the U.S., it has definitely shaped the landscape. When I first moved up here to Iowa in 1991, you could basically look at the U.S. and we were about 75 to 80 million acres of wheat, 70 to 75 million acres of corn. Soybeans at the time was less than 60 million, and we had a good sprinkling of other crops. Today, as I stand before you, it's basically 90 million acres of corn, 90 million acres of beans. Wheat's down to 45 to 50 million acres. And those other smaller crops have continued to get smaller. Did the government plan that? No. The market determined that. Again, it goes back to how are we using these crops and what can you do with them? One of the biggest things, and you're going back to my answer to that last question, when you think about what, if you will, transportation fuel use did to agriculture, it created markets for ethanol, for biodiesel. And so, if you will, ag responded. Farmers are just like any other small business. They're responding to a profit motive. I have to create enough value to support me and my family. And so I'm going to plant what creates that value. And increasingly over the past couple of decades, it has been corn and soybeans. And in fact, bear with me, I'm going to flip you all the way back to these big, tables at my front end. The idea is as you look at world production in corn and soybeans, as I mentioned, it wasn't just the U.S. has had the 5 best years in corn production. It's been the world. In fact, areas like, and my favorite one on this here is the Ukraine. A decade ago, Ukraine would have been the 20th largest producer of corn in the world. Now they are number 5, soon to be number 4. Why are they growing so much corn? Is it because the government told them to? No. Why they're doing it is because they see economic opportunity globally, and they're chasing after it. You see that same thing when you're looking at the U.S. system. Now, as far as China with the steel, I can't tell you whether they did that same thing or not. What I can tell you is that it's possible that, if you will, their steel market is reacting the same way our ag markets have. There has been strong demand for steel globally, and anybody who can produce it has been trying to fill that void. Do you sometimes overbuild? Sure, because demands are fickle. You can't guarantee that if you grow it, someone will want to use it. You can just hope that they do.
I think that is all the time that we have today. Thank you again so much, Chad. I also want to thank our sponsors, the University of Iowa's International Programs, the University of Iowa's Honors Programs, the University of Iowa Public Policy Center, and the Stanley UI Foundation Support Organization for their generous support. And I want to thank today's special sponsors, Neil Chong, UBS Matching Gifts, Alan Swanson, and Blank & McCune Realtors. And we thank City Channel 4 for making our programs available to viewing audiences. Now, Chad, as a small token of our appreciation, I would like to present you with the highly coveted Iowa City Foreign Relations Council mug. Thank you. Thank you so much, Chad. Thank you, everybody. We are adjourned.